So I want to introduce myself. I'm Paula Harris. I'm representing the Jewish United Fund. I'm the Senior Associate VP in Community Outreach and Engagement. JUF is, of course, very honored to partner with Northwestern University on this annual lecture. And it's just one example of JUF's close collaboration with this really incredible institution of Northwestern University. Just a couple highlights of the partnership. For over a decade, the Israel Studies Project has brought Israeli postdoc fellows to educate Northwestern students on the history of the Middle East and Israeli culture, and they also serve as resources to the larger community in their field of expertise. And this program is a joint effort between the Crown Family Center for Jewish and Israel Studies and JUF. Great part, just a wonderful partnership. And I think really one of the most important aspects of our partnership is the university's support of its Jewish students and the institutions that serve them. The university has strived to ensure that Jewish students are an integral part of the campus community, and its investment in the Crown Center has enabled the university to be a leading institution in Jewish and Israel studies. And you probably also know that Northwestern University, Hillel, is considered among the finest in the country, offering the, yes, thank you. Thank you for that support. It's offering the highest quality programming in a variety of areas under the leadership of Michael Simon. And we also know that the Northwestern Hillel plays an integral part in the life of Northwestern University and the Evanston community. I'm now going to turn it over to Professor David Shivitz, of the Crown Family Center for Jewish and Israel Studies and the Associate Professor in the Department of History. Again, welcome, everybody, to what I think is going to be a fascinating discussion.
Good evening, everyone. Welcome to campus. I'm really delighted to be able to welcome you here. My name is David Shivitz. I'm a professor of Jewish history here at Northwestern, and I'm the director of the Crown Family Center for Jewish and Israel Studies. It's wonderful to have you all here for the latest installment of our Klutznick Lecture in Jewish Civilization, which, as you just heard, we host in partnership every year with the Jewish United Fund of Chicago. Before we kick things off, I wanted to say a couple of words, if you'll permit me, about the Crown Family Center, and also to acknowledge some of the people who've made tonight's event possible. The Crown Family Center for Jewish and Israel Studies is an academic hub here at Northwestern for undergraduate and graduate education, faculty and student research, and public programming for the campus community and the broader public. Our students and affiliated faculty members and visiting professors and postdoctoral fellows study, teach, and research Jewish history, Jewish philosophy and thought, Hebrew and Yiddish language and literature, Holocaust studies, and the history, politics, and culture of the State of Israel. The Crown Family Center is comprised of over a dozen full-time faculty members, a robust group of visitors. We have an undergraduate major, we have 2 undergraduate minors, a graduate cluster for PhD students, and we offer dozens of courses each year that enroll many hundreds of students. I want to encourage those of you who'd like to learn more about our center and the programming that we do to please grab a newsletter. There are some available on your way in or on your way out. Sign up for our mailing list, follow us on social media. And it would be great for you to stay abreast of the academic programming that we put on a very consistent basis. Especially this year, especially since October 7th, we've really devoted immense resources to teaching students and the NU community and the broader public as well about issues that feel really timely to be educated about. Jewish history, Israeli politics and society, the dynamics of anti-Semitism, and so on. We'd be really gratified if the academic perspective and resources that we provide to our students were made available to as wide an audience as possible. So please do stay posted and continue to join us in the future. The truth is, though, that part of what makes our center really unique every year among the university's departments and programs is our consistent dedication to communal engagement, to building bridges between the university and the wider public. And the best example of this community-facing mission is what you just heard about from Paula, our long-standing and very, very generative partnership with the Jewish Federation. with whom we're co-hosting tonight's event. You heard about our postdoctoral fellowship in Israel studies and about our work with Hillel. I won't read through all the stuff that I wrote that reproduces what you heard already from Paula. But I will just flag the fact that this lecture in particular, which is a great public symbol of this longstanding partnership, is now in its 37th year. So if you think back to nearly 4 decades worth of productive partnership, we really are building on quite a lot together still today. And part of that lecture's mission is to make available to our audience really sophisticated insight into the long history of Jewish civilization and its impact on the present and future of the Jewish world. And so we're really delighted this year to welcome somebody who can speak to many of those issues, Professor David Kertzer. He's the Paul Dupuy University Professor of Social Science at Brown University, where he also served as provost from the years 2006 to 2011. If you look him up and you read his official bio, there's some sort of sterile language about the fact that he's a scholar of Italian politics and society and political symbolism. But I think it would be more accurate to say that Professor Kertzer is perhaps the preeminent living authority on modern Italian history, the history of the modern Catholic Church, Holocaust scholarship. He's the author of more than a dozen books, which have been translated into a dozen languages, which range from German and Hungarian and Dutch to Brazilian and Chinese, so truly somebody whose scholarship has had an impact the world over. His most celebrated books include the Pulitzer Prize-winning The Pope and Mussolini, The Secret History of Pius XI and the Rise of Fascism in Europe, and The Kidnapping of Edgardo Mortara, which was a finalist for the National Book Award. His most recent book, is The Pope at War, The Secret History of Pius XII, Mussolini, and Hitler, which is the latest in a series of magisterial works on the role of the Catholic Church in modern Europe and during the Second World War in particular. He's the past president of the Social Science History Association, the Society for the Anthropology of Europe. His books have won awards, basically every academic award you can imagine. I had to shrink down the bio tremendously due to the number of accolades that we could draw upon. But suffice it to say, we are in extremely good hands to get some really sophisticated perspective on the topic of tonight's lecture, Pius XII and the Holocaust. Now, the format for tonight is that Professor Kertzer will give some opening remarks, but then the majority of the time is going to be spent in conversation with one of our own faculty members, Professor Ben Frommer, Associate Professor of History and the inaugural director of the Holocaust Education Foundation at Northwestern University. He has his own very distinguished bio as well that I'm going to truncate in the interest of time. The two of them are going to have some conversation on stage, pull some themes out of the topic, and then we'll turn things over to the audience for Q&A. So without any further ado, please join me in welcoming Professor David Kertzer.
Well, thank you. It's great to be here at Northwestern. Thanks for inviting me. Thanks to the Jewish Federation as well for making this evening possible. And thank you for coming on a rainy night. As you heard, what I thought might make sense is for me just to spend a very few minutes to give some context for the discussion that I'm about to have with Professor Frommer about this controversy over the silence of the Pope during the Holocaust and about the recent materials that have been made available with the opening of the Vatican archives for the first time ever, just in 2020, for this period, the fraught period of World War II and the Holocaust, enabling us to get a kind of inside look at what was going on in the Vatican in those dramatic days that was not possible before that opening of those archives. Now, I think I have, pull this out. There's, you see the book that came out a little less than a couple of years ago now. In that book, I try to shed new light on this controversy of the question of Pope Pius XII, he was the Pope during World War II, what he knew about the war, how he acted, what he knew about the Holocaust, why he acted the way he did, what was going on behind the scenes that would enable us to understand, among other things, his silence during the Holocaust, that is, his failure ever to denounce the ongoing attempts of the Germans to exterminate the Jews of Europe. My own interest in the questions, I'll largely be talking as an academic, are based on academic research, but I've got to admit that there's a certain personal element here as well, a certain kind of family history that I'll just briefly allude to here. Because I grew up hearing stories about Italy during World War II, including the Jews of Italy in World War II, because my father was a rabbi and was a chaplain, Jewish chaplain in the U.S. Army with the troops at Anzio beachhead. Anzio is where the troops, Allied troops, landed in January 1944 as part of the effort to be able to liberate Rome and then march further up and liberate the rest of Italy from the German occupation. Here's something from, as you see, Look magazine had this shot of my father in a wine cellar conducting a service in April of 1944. 2 months later, he would be with the troops the day of the liberation of Rome, and then he would, along with the chief rabbi of Rome, 4 days later, conduct the first service in a liberated major city of, a Jewish service, a liberated major city of Europe. So this was all something, as a child, I grew up hearing about. But of course, there are more recent and more academic reasons for my interest in this topic. There's been, as I'm sure those of you coming this evening are well aware, a huge controversy over the behavior of the Pope during the war. The Pope has his defenders. In fact, many will say he was courageous. He was a great foe of fascism and of Nazism, that he saved hundreds of thousands of Jews, that he should be made a saint. In fact, there's been an effort for now a long time underway to have him declared a saint that's been put on hold. As a result, probably the controversy publicly became a huge one. With 1963, there may be people here old enough to remember this, a play by a German playwright, Rolf Hochhuth, called The Deputy, which showed various priests pleading with the Pope to speak out against the murder of the Jews of Europe and his refusal to do so. A play that, by the way, although performed throughout Europe and throughout in the US, in North America, was banned in Italy, given the influence of the church in Italy. As a result of that controversy that got spawned with the play, really, the Vatican, the Pope at the time, Paul VI, in 1965, decided to commission a group of Jesuits. There had been these demands: open the archives, let us see for ourselves the truth of what happened during the war in the Vatican. And the Pope said, well, it's very premature to open the archives, but I'll commission a group of 4 Jesuits to go into those archives, and they will publish all the relevant documents. And in fact, they published these 12 volumes that you see there, which were presented as all the relevant documents in the Vatican archives having to do with World War II. Reports, for example, from bishops and archbishops in German-occupied Europe throughout the war years. But then in 1999, a book some of you may have read became a bestseller with the very provocative title, as you see there, Hitler's Pope. And the debate, the controversy went on. Various Jewish organizations, as well as scholarly groups, called on the Vatican to open the archives. Well, I had published a book. They had opened in 2006. They had opened the archives to the previous papacy, Pius XI. And partly based on that, I had written a book about Pius XII's predecessor, Pius XI, who was Pope. He became Pope the same year Mussolini became head of the Italian government in 1922, and then died in February 1939, so just before the war began. His number 2 man throughout the 30s was, as Secretary of State, was Eugenio Pacelli, the man who would succeed him and become the controversial Pope Pius XII. So I had already worked on quite a bit in the archives of the Vatican and elsewhere on Pacelli in his role as number 2 in the Vatican. And I made something of a bet when Francis, or sometime after Francis became Pope, that part of his effort much ballyhooed effort at greater transparency would include finally opening the archives of the papacy of Pius XII, including the war years. So kind of making that bet, I began working in the other archives that were open, because you can't do a good history anyway of these years and of the role of the Vatican throughout the war if you just look at church archives. You have to look at a variety of other material, and in fact, I worked in the Italian fascist government archives, the Nazi archives in Berlin, the French Foreign Service archives in Paris and Nantes, covering both the Paris and the Vichy governments, and the British archives in London and the American archives in outside of Washington, College Park. Because each of these countries, Italy, Germany, France, Britain, US, they each had envoys in the Vatican throughout the war years. They were meeting on a daily basis with the people around the Pope and with the Pope himself on occasion. And they were sending virtually daily reports back to their government, whether Berlin, Rome, London, and so on, about giving often practical transcripts of those discussions that they had with the people around the Pope. This is on an almost daily basis. So my problem was that if I had all that, and knowing that there was a chance they were going to open these archives, and I finished the work with the tens of thousands of pages of documents I had digitized from these other archives, and the Vatican archives were still not open, what would I do? I'd found many interesting nuggets and had shed new light on this history, but the fear was I'd work on a book, and then 2 days before it came out, they'd announce the opening of the Vatican archives, and my book would be seen as kind of old news. So I was, I have to admit, being very lucky that I had just barely finished going through those tens of thousands of pages from the other archives when Francis announced and had the archives open. The archives, this then led to another slight problem, which was the date that the archives would finally be opened was March 2nd, 2020. Now, I arranged to be on sabbatical for that semester. I rented, with my wife Susan, rented an apartment in Rome for several months, beginning the end of February. But without going into this kind of drama, there was a new virus or new bug around, new disease that had left China and now seemed to have its epicenter where? In Italy. And so the first day of the opening of the archives, I was there. This picture shows me, is more an example of the difference between an American university professor and a German university professor. We're standing outside the door to what had been, until Francis recently renamed it, the Vatican Secret Archive, the largest archive in the Vatican. He renamed it, he got rid of the secret, it's now called the Vatican Apostolic Archive. And so I was there. Actually, I have one colleague I'll talk about who works with me in my research, but I can't compete in some ways with my German colleague, Hubert Wolf, who's an esteemed professor of German history, especially German Vatican history in the 20th century. He's also a priest. He's able to bring a whole series, I'm not sure the right term, acolytes, assistants, postdocs, but he came there with a team of about 7 of his people, younger people to work with him. Anyway, we're waiting outside there. Then you see, as we sign in, they finally at 8:30 that morning, March 2nd, open up, and you see me looking down at my identity card for the Vatican as we sign in. But then the end of that first week, so there with Roberto Benedetti is the historian who works with me. He's Roman. But we're there, put in our 45 hours that it's open that week, but by Friday afternoon, before we leave, someone comes around and puts a piece of paper on our desks which says the Vatican archives are closed until further notice. And 3 days later, of course, none of us knew, this is going to be a couple of weeks, what's going to happen. But when the following, I forget, I think it was a Tuesday night, each night, Susan and I would watch the news where the prime minister would come on, and he said, you were not allowed to leave your apartments and until further notice. So the result was 12 hours later, we were on the last plane out of Rome, headed back to the US. I was lucky, though, because they did reopen the archive in June, so it was just closed for 3 months. Now we're talking about 2020. And as I mentioned, the person who works with me, Roberto Benedetti, is a PhD in church and Italian history. He worked himself after he got his PhD for 2 years in the Vatican archives as an archivist. He's Roman, so he was able to be there daily after the opening. Other Italians weren't allowed. Forget other foreigners who wouldn't be there for another couple of years. But you couldn't cross provincial boundaries for several months in Italy after this. So we were in daily correspondence, and I ended up, in writing this book, having about 8,000 pages of these newly opened archives that I had digitized and able to put together. I think of it as kind of triangulating documents from the different archives around the same dates and the same events, so that you have what you can find from the Vatican archive, let's say October 16th, that I might talk about briefly, 1943, when the SS rounded up 1,000 Jews in Rome to send them to their death. So you not only have what I could find October 16th, 17th, 18th, as the Jews were being held waiting to get on the train to Auschwitz, what I could find in the Vatican archives, what I could find in the German archives, the Italian fascist archives, the British, the American, so on, archives. Well, there were those who said there wouldn't be much new to be found. And after all, you had to remember those 12 volumes with thousands of pages of documents that had been published between 1965 and 81 by the Vatican. I found out that was not true, that in fact there was much that was not known, including some rather dramatic developments. Just one of them, I discovered that shortly after, within weeks of Pius XII becoming Pope in 1939, Hitler saw a new opportunity, and I decided to send a special envoy, this man, Prince Philip von Hessen, who I think is a great-grandson of Queen Victoria of England, among other things, but he was also married to the daughter of the King of Italy at the time, Mafalda, daughter of Victor Emmanuel III. And he was a close friend of Hitler. Hitler sent him to negotiate with the Pope, which he would do over many months. The amazing thing is not only that I discovered this, which had been hidden by the Vatican for 80 years, but that we found basically transcripts of their discussions, which were, by the way, in German. The Pope had spent 12 years as a nuncio in Germany and was fluent in German. So kind of, as a historian, one of those incredible finds that you come across. But there are many other new developments as well. One understood much better the great emphasis the Pope and the Vatican put on saving converted Jews. One also found that the Pope had one man above all he trusted for advice and turned to for advice on any Jewish matter. And in seeing the private notes of that prelate, one sees his deep anti-Semitism. So many new things come up, but as I said, it's not just the Vatican archives to really understand this history. It's putting those materials together with the other materials we have from these other sources, and that's what I tried to do in my book. I would just, because we can deal with this at a somewhat abstract level, but I always like to bring this down to what actually we're talking about here, which is the mass murder of the Jews of Europe. And when the Jews, I mentioned October 16th, 1943, over 1,000 Jews were rounded up by the SS in Rome, who had only recently, the Germans had only recently occupied Italy. And they were put 2 days later, they were held for 2 days right outside the Vatican. But then they were put on a train, went directly to Auschwitz. They arrived there exactly a week after they had been seized. And they were met as the train stopped by this man, as I'm sure his name is familiar to many of you, Josef Mengele, who directed all the children, all the old people, other looked sickly to one side. They were put on trucks that went directly to the gas chamber that day. And a smaller number, mainly men, were sent to work camps where all but 16 would die. Who were those people? Just sort of in these kind of introductory comments, just again, I think we need to put faces on this. Elena Spizzichino and her 7-year-old daughter were sent to the gas chamber that day, as were Marina and Claudio Mieli with their mother. So that's what kind of led me to want to do this work, and I look forward and thank Professor Farmer for joining me for our discussion, and then for your questions afterward. Thank you.
Why don't you take it? Thank you very much. Thank you for that wonderful introduction, for the audience, and for the Crown Center and the Federation. This is a great honor and really wonderful. David Kertzer, of course, as David mentioned, Shayevitz in the introduction, is a field-defining scholar within the Academy, and of course, a public-facing historian in ways that is a model for the rest of us. You actually, most of what you worked towards in your introduction was one of the questions I had, and I think you already addressed part of it, but to start off, you clearly had the idea of this book in mind when you completed the other one, and you gave us some indication of some of the finds that you discovered, which are really both troubling and fascinating. I was wondering if those finds changed your overall view of Cardinal Pacelli, of Pius XII, that you had from his earlier period as papal nuncio and in Germany and Secretary of State. Did you see something new that altered your view of him, or some sort of evolution perhaps later on?
Well, you know, in that earlier book, The Pope of Mussolini, I talked about the fact that Pius XI had a great antagonism toward Hitler. And one mistake I think people often make is they think of the fascist regimes together in the Vatican and talk about that. But in fact, the night and day that the Italian fascist regime could be, I think, described as a clerico-fascist regime. They privileged the position of the church and sponsored the church and included the church in all their fascist organizations and so on. Whereas the Germans, the Nazis, were seen as antagonists by the Vatican, as trying to weaken the influence of the Catholic Church in Germany. So Pius XI had, in his last years as Mussolini increasingly came to embrace Hitler, grown very upset with Mussolini and continued to have the Vatican newspaper denounce the Germans, not for anything having to do with Jews, but for what they saw as the persecution of the church in Germany. So throughout that time, I knew that Pacelli, as Secretary of State, was constantly meeting with the fascist, the Italian ambassador to the Holy See, and other high prelates who wanted to stop the Pope from doing anything that could undermine their good relations, especially with the fascist regime in Italy. So, that already had this kind of picture of him. I think, maybe one way to answer that would be some people would suggest that his silence during the Holocaust was primarily the result of anti-Semitism. And I don't think that's the case. I don't think that's the major explanation. There's anti-Semitism there. There's anti-Semitism in the United States then. And one of the best indications of this is the whole question of the silence of the Pope began not with the Jews, but began with the Poles, right? So the World War II is generally dated, the beginning of it, to the German invasion of Poland, September 1st, 1939. Poland, which was, although it had a very large Jewish minority, was largely Roman Catholic. And among the people that the German soldiers were most worried about were the local parish priests, particularly in western part of Poland that they wanted to annex to the Third Reich. They saw the local parish priests as leading Polish kind of nationalist resistance. And so when the Nazi army, when the German army goes into Poland in September 39, they arrest hundreds of parish priests and send them to concentration camps. So they are begging, and the church and the now Polish diplomats in exile are begging the Pope to speak out and denounce this, which he refuses to do.
Right.
So I think that I try in my book to get it, then why did he act, why was he silent? And part of the issue is that both Mussolini used to brag about this, and Hitler knew how to intimidate the Pope.
Mm-hmm. So actually that was, I was very interested as I started my career as a scholar of Eastern European studies with precisely the Pope's silence about Poland, not just after the invasion, but actually in the months leading up to the invasion as well. You show where the Polish priests and cardinals and others involved are trying to get Pius XII to speak out. And what comes out in that conversation, but then repeatedly in your book during the war, is an almost a mantra of the Pope and those around him about the 40 million German Catholics, or sometimes the 45 million German Catholics, where it seems that, coming from your book, the Pope and the men around him are much more concerned with German Catholics than certainly with Polish Catholics, but also with Slovak Catholics, Czech Catholics, French Catholics, and so on. And so is that part of his own personal experience in Germany, or the fear, as you say, of the Nazis in particular, but this particular elevation of German Catholics over other Catholics really struck me as quite strange.
Yeah, well, I know you're an expert on Slovak situation where, of course, the head of the government was Monsignor Tiso, was a Catholic priest. And so there the situation, each of these situations is a bit different. But I think you're onto something important here, which is, it does seem surprising. You have tens of millions of Polish Catholics, so what about them? Well, the Pope did spend, as I mentioned, from 1917 to 1929, he was a papal nuncio in Germany. He became very fond of German Catholics. He was very close, not to the Nazis, but to conservative Catholic elite in Germany. And so he did see the world in part through their eyes, through, I'd say, not through National Socialists, but through conservative elite Catholics in Germany. Also, that church was, did have greater weight in the Vatican and had for a long, long time. So yeah, that's certainly part of it. But it was, and he was worried that he would create a schism. I think even the Reformation was in the back of his mind about what had happened in the 16th century. And something like this had happened in the Protestant church, of course, which would split around pro-Nazi and the non-Nazi, you might say, although still anti-Semitic Protestant churches in Germany. So he was afraid that if he were to denounce the National Socialist government and its war, he would produce a split. And that was early on. Later on, when it looked like, well, there's another issue here, as I talk about in my book, which early years of the war, he thought the Germans were going to win the war, as did most people. They had very good reason to think, in 1940, the Germans were going to win the war. And so he was worried about how to protect the church in Europe under Nazi rule. And so this motivated a lot of his action as well. Later on, there's another story toward the end of the war when it became clear that the Germans were in fact going to lose the war. He became worried that if he were to denounce the ongoing extermination of the Jews of Europe, which after all was being carried out by Christians, people who thought they were Christian, including Catholics, not by people who thought they were pagans for the most part, that he would later get blamed for the defeat of Germany by the Catholics, and that would lead to a disaster for the Catholic Church in Germany after the war. So this too is part of the picture.
And there's a certain brutal lesson to that in the fact that the Poles could be taken for granted, I suppose, is the implication there. Earlier in your response to my first question, you mentioned the men around Pius XI who were trying to restrain him. And in reading, it's necessary to this type of work, whether it be your book on Pius XI or Pius XII, there's a focus on the individual, on the Pope as central, which in a hierarchical organization like the Vatican makes a lot of sense. But it's also clear from your book that he comes out of a milieu, what you call the black, or what is called the black aristocracy, of men who have been, are bred by the Vatican, live in the Vatican, aren't tied to particular countries. And to that extent, he seems very much a reflection of the Vatican and not someone who charted his own path in any particular way.
Yeah, I just take issue with one part of that, which
Sure.
is that it was a very Italian Vatican.
Right.
I mean, there were about 24 cardinals made up the Curia, the central administration of the Vatican. Of the 24, 23 were Italian. And the only anti-fascist was the one French, Cardinal Cicéron. So he was a man who, his father and his grandfather were both close to the popes at the time. His father was a dean of the lawyers in the Vatican. His grandfather had accompanied Pius IX in exile back in the mid-19th century, and so forth. So he never had been a parish priest even. He immediately joined the Secretary of State after his ordination. So his experience of the world was, on the one hand, all Roman and all church and Vatican, and then this experience, the 12 years he had in Germany. So I think this is what shaped him.
Fascinating. One of the issues that comes out during the war, not just in Rome, but in many other European countries, is the distinction drawn between Jews and Jews who had converted, or Catholics who have, or Protestants who have Jewish origins. And this is something that Pope Pius XII also draws repeatedly, that distinction, and expresses concern about these Catholics who were once Jews. And I was interested, one, if you could comment more about that for the audience, but also in my own work, there's a distinction often drawn between those who were viewed as genuine Catholics and those who had simply converted in the last years in order to evade some sort of persecution, and whether Pius drew that distinction and whether there was sort of categories of Jews who had become Christians or Catholics.
Well, in the fall of 1938, Mussolini announces the racial laws, which come as quite a shock to the Jews of Italy, because whereas Nazism, of course, was anti-Semitic in its DNA, that was not true of Italian fascism. And so when Mussolini announces his what will be called the racial laws, beginning in September 1938, the Jews of Italy feel betrayed. Many of them were members of the Fascist Party. Probably as large a proportion of the Jews as Catholics in Italy were members of the Fascist Party. And what did those racial laws do? They said all Jews are thrown out of school. Jewish kids, all Jewish teachers, professors are thrown out of their job. All Jews in the military, in the public service, in banks, in insurance, and so on, are all thrown out of work. So the Jews are totally immiserated. Does the Vatican protest this? So this is before the war, before Germans are involved. And yes, the Vatican protests, but only protests one thing. It protests that any Jews who converted to Catholicism should be treated as Jews rather than Catholics. And so that's the one thing they protest. And in fact, in 1943, when briefly Mussolini is overthrown and before the Germans come in, so in August of 1943, the Pope at the time now, Pius XII, has his envoy to the Italian government meet with the new minister in charge of the racial laws and says, well, we think in general the racial laws are good, but you've got to change the part about treating baptized Jews as if they're still Jews when they should be not be considered Jews for the racial laws. Later on, one of the things I discuss in my book, I mentioned October 16th, is so October 16th, 1,259 people from the Nazis' list of Jews, the SS list that they had of all the Jews in Rome, were rounded up, put on trucks, and taken to a military college right outside the walls of Vatican City. And they're held there for 2 days. So one question is, why were they held there for 2 days? Why weren't they just put directly, because they were trained waiting to take them to Auschwitz? Well, it turns out that they spent part of those 2 days going through the baptismal credentials of the Jews they had, that the people had been on their Jewish list, and releasing any of those who were baptized. Meanwhile, what was going on in the Vatican, which we now know due to these recently opened archives, is they were furiously giving lists to the German ambassador to the Holy See of baptized Jews who should be released. And they were released. So 1,259 were captured that day. 1,020 were on the train 2 days later and sent to Auschwitz. Now, the question of how did the Vatican view Jews who were converted? The other thing that's kind of embarrassing for Jews in Italy, and therefore gotten rather little attention, is that with the racial laws, huge numbers of Italian Jews tried to convert to avoid losing their jobs, their miseration, and so forth. And a rather significant proportion of all the Jews of Italy got baptized. So both the church, but especially actually the racial law, racial office of the fascist government that administered these anti-Semitic laws was very attentive to the people who were thought to have converted for what they called opportunismo, right? Opportunism, rather than presumed some sort of spiritual reason. But the church, I found rather little evidence at that time that this was a major concern of the church. In general, the church seemed not displeased that a large number, I mean, if there are now a lot fewer Jews in Italy than there were, it's not just because 7,500 were murdered and quite a few ended up in Israel, but large numbers got baptized.
Interesting. Could you comment on the Vatican and the Catholic Church in comparison with the other Christian churches of Europe? Is there something particular about the Roman Catholic hierarchy, the centralization in Rome, that led to a different response to the Holocaust?
Well, I'm not an expert on other countries and other churches. I will say that I sometimes feel it's a little unfair to the Catholic Church when it gets all the attention of this issue, because if you look in Germany at the behavior of the Protestant churches in Germany, it was certainly no better than the Catholic Church. And again, the amount of virulent anti-Semitism in the Protestant churches in Germany was very notable. And in fact, to some extent in Germany, if you look at like Der Stürmer, this anti-Semitic weekly publication that was so influential in Germany, there were regular criticisms of Roman Catholic priests who were thought to be betraying their Christianity by defending Jews. So there was some sense in the Nazi hierarchy that Protestants were more friendly to their movement than the Catholic Church was. But there's also this feeling, of course, from the Nazi point of view, that the Catholics had, by the nature of their religion, some allegiance outside of Germany, namely to the Vatican and to, therefore, Rome, which you didn't have with German Protestants.
Exactly, great. So looking then at the overall picture, I mean, one of the sort of provocative arguments you advance towards the end of the book is that, taken by the measure of what the Pope, Pius XII, imagined was his mission, to protect either the Roman Catholic Church as a whole or narrowly the Vatican and the hierarchy, in an institutional manner, he succeeded. In a moral fashion, you point out that he failed. I was wondering, were there costs even to this institutional success that you can speak about and identify vis-a-vis some of these trans-European, or even within Italy itself, with the position of the church thereafter?
Well, I'd like to say that that cost was extracted as a result of the silence, and before that, of the fact that the Italian Catholic Church, which came under the Pope, I mean, it's not like other countries where you have a cardinal primate like Austria or Poland and so on. In Italy, essentially the primate is the Bishop of Rome, the Pope. And when Mussolini announces in June 1940 that he's joining the war against, he's declaring war on Britain and France and joining with Hitler, the Catholic Church in Italy lines up entirely behind the war effort on behalf of the Axis. I mean, the bishops, the archbishops, all the main publications, all the Catholic lay organizations, leadership says, to be a good Catholic, you need to be part of this Axis war. Even more so when the next year, the Axis turns against the Soviet Union. Now it becomes a holy crusade. I think Americans, when we think about the Allies, we think, Britain and the US and maybe France. We don't think of the Soviet Union, but from the church point of view, the Allies was in good part the Soviet Union, which was the great evil enemy of the church. So I think this is the situation from the church point of view. The other thing that maybe should be mentioned here is there was 9 months where Rome was occupied by German military, and October 16th, the roundup of the Jews took place obviously while Germany controlled Rome. And the Pope was very concerned to maintain amicable relations with the German military that was occupying Rome, so didn't want to be seen to be doing anything to criticize them. So this too was part of the dynamic.
Mm-hmm. And getting to the topic of the talk today and the silence that followed, not just the silence of the Pope during the war, but the silence that followed the war about the Pope's role in regards to the Holocaust. The argument was advanced that the Church's anti-Judaism was somehow distinct from Nazi anti-Semitism, and you challenged that view.
Yeah, I actually wrote a book about this because some of you may recall that, John Paul II, as a result of all this controversy, which included the question, did the Christian churches bear any responsibility for the demonization of Jews that could have made the Holocaust possible? So he called on, there is a commission for religious relations with the Jews, is its name. The Pope, John Paul II, called on this commission headed by a cardinal to investigate this issue. And with this specific question, the Catholic Church, did the Catholic Church, had it engaged in demonization of the Jews that could have in any way helped contribute to the Holocaust? After, I think, 11 years of study, they came up with their statement, I think in 1998, called We Remember, the English title. The preface is written by the Pope himself, so it couldn't have had higher visibility in the church. And it basically took this, it made this distinction you're referring to. It said, unfortunately, some sons and daughters, doesn't say popes and church councils, were engaged in negative religious views of Jews. But this had nothing to do with the Holocaust, because the Holocaust was a product of modern anti-Semitism, which was based not on religious demonization of Jews, but rather social, economic, political, and racial negative views of Jews. Well, partly because I'd been working in Vatican archives before that, and partly because I also read Vatican and church publications in the years leading up to the Holocaust, I knew this was totally untrue. I mean, it made absolutely no sense historically. That in fact, the social, economic, political, negative views of Jews was being promulgated by the church throughout those decades. And what many Europeans, certainly in Italy, which didn't have that many Jews, only 0.1% of the Italian population was Jewish. It's like 100th rate of Polish. In Poland, about 10% of the population was Jewish. So what did most Italians know about Jews? In most of Italy, there were no Jews. So what they learned was what they heard from the parish priests and the Sunday sermons. So yeah, this unfortunately remains the position of the church at the same time as there's certainly, I say the main position of the church. The church is very, very heterogeneous. Even the Vatican, you can't talk about the Vatican, it's very heterogeneous. There are many who are unhappy with this situation and think a more clear-eyed view of this history will be important.
Mm-hmm. I was wondering, you mentioned briefly that you would expect or expected Pope Francis to open up the archives. Some people must have had some inkling that these earlier volumes had skipped passages, had dropped certain documents. Do you have any insight looking backwards on to what extent the motivation of Pope Francis, and again, those around him who must have advised him, for opening up these archives that are clearly going to shed, or likely to shed, negative light on Pope Pius XII?
Right. Yeah, so this is an interesting question. The Pope, for one thing, he's known, at least to those around the Vatican, for not taking advice from fellow cardinals very much.
Okay.
In fact, they complain he'll pay more attention to what his barber tells him than what a cardinal has to say. Don't know if that's accurate, but that said, I mean, one thing I have learned is even those in the working in the Vatican archives and their different archives are rather split about this, and some have felt it important that this history get corrected. Others are much more defensive. So I don't know. Francis has never said anything critical, actually, about any of his predecessors. I mean, popes just don't do that. Mm-hmm. And he certainly has never said anything critical about Pius XII that I'm aware of. But how much he knew of what was likely to come out, I think that's an interesting question. I really don't know the answer to that. Could only speculate.
So, since we're looking at the positive side of Pope Francis, now the criticism has been, particularly more recently, he seems to have adopted a position vis-a-vis the Russian invasion of Ukraine that bears certain analogies to what Pope Pius XII did with regard to the war in Europe, a position of supposed neutrality, of an unwillingness to condemn one side or the other, and that has opened up the Pope to a certain amount of criticism that then, in some ways, although on a far different scale and with different stakes, resembles some of what you're discussing.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's some parallel. To understand the Pope's reluctance to, I mean, it's not just a matter of criticizing the Russian regime for, its war on Ukraine, but criticizing the Russian Orthodox Church, which is, 1,000% behind the war effort, including the Archbishop Kirill, the head of the Russian Orthodox Church. The Pope, had as one of his priorities trying to bring about better relations with the Eastern Orthodox churches, and had, in fact, labored hard to develop a good relation with Kirill. Kirill only agreed to meet with him once, and that meeting had to take place in Cuba. Curiously, he wouldn't come to Rome. They had to be on kind of neutral turf, but it turned out to be Cuba. It looked like there might be a second meeting coming up. Meanwhile, Putin had met 3 times with the Pope in Rome since he became Pope 10 years or so ago. So the Pope had been working before the invasion of Ukraine, giving a lot of effort to trying to develop this relationship. So he was rather slow to want to bring it all down by criticizing. So he's occasionally tentatively had rather critical remarks about Russia, but refrained from any kind of full-throated denunciation, or much less of what the church, the Russian Orthodox Church, has become a kind of big supporter of Putin and his war.
Thank you. So, as I started, and you said in your introductory remarks, the book about Pius XII, in a sense, logically followed from the book about Pius XI. Where are you going next?
Well, so I became actually fascinated by some aspects of the racial laws that we were just talking about, particularly when I found out how prevalent baptism was of Jews to escape persecution and eventually help them escape death in the Holocaust in many cases. I became fascinated by the question of why hasn't almost no one studied this, at least from the point of view of the Vatican and Italy. And that, the first year of the racial laws, 10% of Jews got baptized. This is like massive. Who's written about this? Nobody. So these newly open Vatican archives also reflect the fact that, they have a file they call the Jews file, the Serie Hebrae, the Jews series, in the Secretary of State office. This consists of about 35,000 pages of documents, which are notable partly for the fact that, unlike any other archival documents, they've been put online, so any of you can go tonight and read them. I've actually read through the 35,000 pages. There are 2,700 folders, family folders. These are all people who are affected, who are Jews or being treated as Jews, who are appealing for help the Vatican between 1938 and 1944. So you have that. You have the hundreds of thousands of pages of documents in the fascist office in Rome, the archives for the fascist government office that ran the racial laws, the anti-Semitic program. And there you have in them thousands and thousands of baptismal certificates by people who've been categorized as Jews in Italy who want to be categorized as Aryan instead, that is Catholic. So that's largely what I'm working on now.
Great. Very much looking forward to that. We will now open it up to questions from the audience for the remainder of our time. I will, do the standard statement. We're looking for questions, not statements, and questions should have a question mark at the end. So we have a microphone and someone walking. Where is our? Oh, over there. Okay. Well, why don't you, since you're over there, pass it to the person over here, David. Yeah. And you, David, you can move about.
Thank you very much. Is there any credence to the reports that Pius may have communicated with some German conspirators regarding intrigues within the Third Reich?
Yeah, so one of the things you'll read about if you read various defenders of Pius XII in this context is that he took part in conspiracy to try to assassinate Hitler. No historian who knows anything about Pius XII could put any credence in that. He was very timid. He wanted to keep both sides happy. He took pride in the fact that in his speeches he'd have something that either side could quote to show he actually supported them. And of course, each side, the New York Times, if you read the New York Times from the period during the war, you'll have all these stories about Pius XII as on the side of the Allies. Of course, the German press had the same thing on the opposite. There's books written about this supposed involvement of the Pope in conspiracy to assassinate Hitler. He was not happy with Hitler. He would have been happy to see Hitler gone, but he certainly wasn't going to get involved in a conspiracy to assassinate Hitler.
We can go over here, right there. Sure.
I have a question. Professor Kertzer, I'd like you to imagine it's 50 years from now, and your granddaughter is a distinguished professor of history at Brown University, and she wants to look at the, quote, archives related to the relationship between the Catholic Church and the Trump administration, or Obama administration. I'm not going to take a position here. First of all, what would she be doing in terms of archives? And secondly, is there anything in your research that would give her insights in interpreting what's going on between the American administrations and the churches today?
Well, when you say the churches today, it's of course not just the Catholic Church, Protestant churches, especially when it talks about Trump, relationship with Trump and his biggest supporters, albeit the center of the right wing of the Catholic Church in the world is the United States, and the major funding for that movement comes from the United States. But so if we get into Trump and Christian churches, I would think more of the evangelical Protestant churches would come first to mind. In terms of research, the Vatican was not recognized diplomatically by the United States till well after World War II. So in the war period, World War II, there was just, Franklin Roosevelt had an unofficial personal envoy, Myron Taylor, former head of U.S. Steel, as his representative and his assistant in the Vatican. There was not an ambassador, and therefore there was not a papal nuncio in Washington. However, there was an apostolic delegate, which is kind of the layer under where there isn't official recognition, but functions in much the same way a nuncio does. So at the Vatican archives, you have one category with the archive of that nunciature, now nunciature back then, apostolic delegate. So, a future Professor Brown or elsewhere who was interested in the relationship between the Vatican and and U.S. politics, that would certainly be the first place to look. But there are also, each diocese and archdiocese throughout the world normally has its own archive. And so, for example, when the Pope announced the opening of the archives of the Vatican for the papacy of Pius XII, in theory, that extends to all Roman Catholic archives, all these diocesan archives. In fact, for example, for me, the most important diocesan archive probably for this history, getting to World War II, was Rome. And that's at St. John in Lateran Church is where you find that archive. They haven't opened it. And but getting to your question, those would be the kind of sources one would go to, and there'd be plenty of material there.
Hard to select at this point, but I was going to go right here, sort of next to the person with the baseball hat.
About 30 years ago, we had a discussion, and somebody postulated that when Hitler knew that it was the end, that he got absolution from the Pope. And I don't know whether there's any historical fact to it. I guess maybe you could clear that up for me.
No, the answer to that is no, that never happened. The Pope was, when in the spring of 1940, as the German troops were overrunning France and Paris, the French, as well as the Americans, begged the Pope to issue an excommunication of Hitler, who was, baptized Catholic, and Mussolini, for that matter. And the Pope refused to do so and never would. And this becomes more of an issue because 4 years after the war, in 1949, the Pope issues an excommunication of all communists. But he never, forget excommunicating, Nazis, he wouldn't excommunicate Hitler. But anyway, there's I don't believe there's any evidence. Well, he certainly didn't, the Pope didn't send any absolution to Hitler at his death.
We'll go down here in the front. Sure.
So when Verber and Wetzler escaped from Auschwitz in '44, apparently they met with a Vatican representative from Switzerland in maybe June, and it is said that the Pope then appealed to Horthy in Hungary to stop the transports of the Jews to Auschwitz. Is that historically attested?
Yes, so of course the Pope, one thing we know is he had quite good information about the extermination going on in the Jews from early on, and certainly from 41. So because he was getting reports from the bishops in occupied Europe, and as well as reports from, as I talk about in my book, there was a Roman priest who was a chaplain in a hospital train that run by the Italian military that was going back and forth to the Eastern Front, and he would come and regularly report to the Pope about the ongoing mass murder of the Jews of Europe. So he didn't have to wait till 1944 to hear about this. However, it is true that he had his nuncio in Budapest, and he had other nuncios as well, for example, in Slovakia, call on the government not to go ahead with sending the Jews to their death. That did happen. Of course, here we get to the fact that it happens, again, after it was pretty clear that the Germans were going to lose and the Allies were going to win. And the Allies had already made it known that they were going to hold people responsible for the murder of Jews. Anyway, so it's somewhat complicated story, but that is true.
Someone in the back up there, David. We haven't done that corner yet.
So would you say that before the start of the war, the Catholic Church, if I'm not mistaken, intervened to stop or halt or interfere with Action T4, the Nazi genocide of the disabled, and that as a result of that, the Catholic Church would have known that it was capable of influencing Nazi policy if it sort of put its back into it and then chose not to?
Mm-hmm. Well, in fact, although the Vatican still sticks to its line that we've talked about, the German church in, I think, maybe in 2020, but sometime quite recently, came out with a statement, and some other, by the way, national bodies of representing the Catholic Church in other parts of Europe come up with similar statements, which is a kind of mea culpa, and said, we have to realize that the fact that we, first of all, encouraged all good German Catholics to do their part in the Nazi war, and secondly, never issued any protest to the ongoing extermination of the Jews of Europe carried out by Germans that we knew was happening. This was tragic sin. And so they had a statement like that, which is kind of lancing the boil, which is what neither the Vatican nor the Italian Church has been still willing to do. So, yeah, I mean, there's the kind of conjectural history question of, if the Pope, what could have the Pope have done? How much influence could he have had? And there, I guess, my feeling is that, well, I used to answer that kind of question by saying, well, in Italy, a lot. In Germany, the situation was more complicated. For one thing, in Germany, Catholics were a minority. They were a large minority, maybe 40% of the population, but still a minority. Plus, of course, the Pope was Roman, was Italian, and so on, so he represented something very different for the Italian population. Plus, the Italians, Mussolini had a problem on his hands. How he was going to get the Italians behind an effort to go to war on the side of the Nazis. They just fought a war against Germany. Lost half a million Italians were killed. The whole idea of Aryan supremacy wasn't going to appeal to a lot of Italians. So how is he could get them whipped up to being willing to risk their lives to go off to the Russian front, which they sent them to fight on behalf of the Hitler. So the fact, if he had denounced all that early on, that would have been a huge problem for Mussolini. Mussolini, I know from working in the fascist archives, saw this as a huge problem. In the case of Germany, I used to say that maybe it wouldn't have made a lot of difference. I don't know. Recently, last November, I was talking in Italy, actually, to two Germans who are kind of remarkable people. They're probably, I guess, in their 50s. And both their fathers were active Catholics, I mean, very active in Catholic organizations and very devoted, saw themselves very devout Catholics, but also very active in the fascist movement, in the Nazi movement. And according to them, their parents would have been amazed and affected if the Pope had said this was impossible, what you're doing is evil, and so forth. So now I'm a little bit unsure. Maybe it would have had more effect than I thought.
I guess back in that corner somewhere. Sure, you can choose. Everyone's the same to me.
So I'm curious about the period post-World War II. Did the Pope ever show any remorse? I guess he lived till 1958. And was he all supportive of Israel at its formation or in the 56 war?
Well, of course, they never recognized the state of Israel throughout the papacy of Pius XII. I published a piece maybe a couple of years ago based on these newly opened archives about the post-war period having to do with the Finley case that some of you may be familiar with, which is there were two Holocaust orphans. Their parents, they're originally Austrian Jews, but they had fled following 38 to the Anschluss to southern France. And the parents were taken to Auschwitz, and they succeeded in getting their 2, 1, and 3-year-old sons into the hands of a Catholic friend. And after the war, even actually before the war was over, but after the liberation of France, the relatives, so the parents were both murdered at Auschwitz, but the siblings of the parents came back to find their nephews. And I won't go into the details, read my Atlantic article if you're interested. I'm sure find it online. But it was known that a network of Catholic monasteries, monks and nuns and so on, spirited the children from one Catholic institution to the next because the state of the French state ordered the children be returned to the family. And what we didn't know until they opened the archives, and this came to a head in 1953 when I think a dozen nuns and monks were jailed, actually, and weren't going to be released until the children were produced. By this time, they had spirited them to a monastery across the border in Basque Land in Spain. But what was unknown until we discovered in the archives that were just opened was that the Pope was very much involved in this and took the position that they'd been baptized in these years, and that it would be a sin for them to be returned to their family because they would be then guilty of apostasy, terrible sin in the church. And so finally did agree to their return, but only because otherwise, first of all, it's very bad PR for the church in France, and this was a period they were worried the communists might come to power, and so the church needed all the friends it could get, and partly because these clergy people were in jail. They finally said, well, if you have to, let them go, but only with a promise that they not be returned to their family, but or continue to be educated as Catholics, which the family, once they got hold of the kids, took them immediately to one of the siblings who was living in Israel, and that's where they are today. So one of the most striking things I think about all this question of the silence of the Pope is his silence after the Holocaust. He never expressed he never talked about the Holocaust after it happened, publicly, anyway. And it's not something that he ever expressed concern about the role of Christians in the mass murder of the Jews of Europe.
In some sense, isn't that the most revealing? Because what you talk about in your book is calculations about fearing that German Catholics would turn away from Catholicism, or concern about the relationships between the two powers. None of that was a factor after the war.
Yeah, and this actually has gotten very little attention. So it's, and of course, immediately, the other thing we discovered in the Vatican archives is they're filled with appeals to the Allies not to be so harsh on the German war criminals, especially those who were Catholic. And I found a document which refers to this as being Vatican blaming this on the Jews in America having too much power, and Jews being notoriously vindictive, and that's why there were the Nuremberg trials.
Mm-hmm. Did those appeals have any effect? Mm-hmm. Do you have any sense that those appeals had an effect?
I don't know. I haven't, looked at it from the point of view of, the Allied archives for the most part. So, I mean, certainly a lot of these people were given, even if they weren't given light sentences, actually ended up serving very little time in prisons. But I couldn't say that the Vatican had an impact.
Mm-hmm.
What is the role, after the war, what was the role of the Catholic Church, the Pope, or the Vatican in getting Nazi war criminals out of Europe into basically South America?
Yeah, the so-called rat line. There's actually a very good book about this written by Gerald Steinacker called Nazis on the Run. And he's been working, which came out a number of years ago now, but he's been working in these newly opened Vatican archives, so be on the lookout for a kind of new version of this. I was actually at a rather dramatic event last October with the director of the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum and a delegation she was leading, where because the single most influential figure in the church around the Vatican inspiriting Nazi war criminals to South America was Bishop Hudal, who was head of the German church in Rome. And we were invited by his successor, who like Hudal is Austrian, to have dinner. But this was following the fact that after the fact that this rector, priest, agreed to allow the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum to digitize the entire archive of this Bishop Hudal, which includes all sorts of fake ID for various rather significant Nazi war criminals that he was providing. And he then invited us for dinner, this group of us, and the dinner was held with, there are about, I don't know, 30 or so priests in training. They're actually already priests, but they're having further training in Rome, German-speaking priests. And he got up and he said, we've got to recognize the evil done by my predecessor, Bishop Hudal. This is something totally unimaginable that a pope could do. And he gave a very moving speech about how horrendous this was and so forth, at the end of which we went up to speak with him, and one of the people in the delegation said, what made you take this occasion to make this rather heartfelt and dramatic statement for our benefit? He said, no, it wasn't for your benefit, it was for the benefit of those 30 young German priests. So, when we talk about the heterogeneity in the Vatican, in the Catholic Church, I think that's a pretty good example. But, so, and we're learning more, and there are a couple of other historians working on these issues right now with these newly available documents. There was an agency set up, or an aid organization set up by the Vatican during the war years, but then continued after the war years, for aiding refugees from the war. And that became a major center, a significant center for aiding Nazi war criminals, again, mainly if they were Catholic. So we don't have any direct knowledge or direct evidence that the Pope was directly involved. Well, he certainly wasn't directly involved, but how much he knew about this, we don't really know.
Have you heard of a movie that came out? I saw it at the Sonoma Film Festival called Kidnapped, about a child who was supposedly baptized by his babysitter, and the Pope kidnapped this child from a Jewish family, and then it's made by an Italian company. It was about the story of him, family trying to get him back.
I'll let you answer this.
Yeah, I do know something about that. Yeah, so this is the case of Edgardo Mortara. And I published a book in 1997 called The Kidnapping of Edgardo Mortara, or published here. Actually, the Italian edition came out a year earlier, which recounts this story. So this is a story from 1858 from Bologna, a small Jewish community, on one day in June 1858 at the family of Momolo Mortara, Jewish family. The police come to the door and ask to see his 6-year-old child, Edgardo. And they're there because the Inquisitor, because there's still an Inquisition, 1858, and Bologna is part of the Papal States, which still exist. In 1858, there was not an Italian nation in 1858. For centuries, the church, where it had control of the police, as it did in the Papal States, directly, or other places more indirectly, where a Jewish child was thought to have been secretly baptized, even unbeknownst to the parents, and certainly against their will, the position of the church was that that child is now Catholic and cannot be allowed to be raised by a Jewish family or again be guilty of apostasy. And so there had been a rumor that a former illiterate teenage servant girl had secretly baptized this child, and so the police were sent by the Inquisitor, and the child was taken away from his parents. And this became This had been going on for centuries without any protests except from powerless Jews. But now things were different. I won't go into why it was different in Europe. But so it became an international scandal. Like in San Francisco, 3,000 people go to a rally, Free Edgardo, 2,000 in New York. But the emperor, the French emperor, becomes involved, demands that the child be freed and so forth. But the Pope holds on and plays actually not an insignificant role in the demise of the Papal States and the founding of modern Italy. So this case, which had become so famous and well-known internationally in the 19th century, had become almost entirely forgotten until my book came out. And I then, a bit of a long story, but ended up selling the film rights to Steven Spielberg for making a film. He hired Tony Kushner to write screenplay. He wrote a wonderful screenplay, and don't get me started on this. This would go on for a while, but cut to the chase. In the end, Spielberg has decided not to do the film, even though we had Mark Rylance was going to be the Pope, and everything was set up, and the other 35 actors all in place. But so an Italian filmmaker who's actually rather prominent, Marco Bellocchio, announced that since he heard, this was now 3 or 4 years ago, he heard that Spielberg wasn't going ahead making the film based on my book. He was going to make a film based on the story, but not based on my book. He knew that Spielberg had the rights to my book, so. So that film came out with the Cannes Film Festival last spring, and I saw it in June in Rome, and it's about to come out. And it's been in some Jewish film festivals already in the US, and is about to be released somewhat more broadly in the US. In a month or so. And so I'm in an awkward position commenting on it because it puts me in a somewhat awkward position. It's all an Italian film. So unlike what Spielberg's film and Tony Kushner's marvelous screenplay and so on, it's a film, all Italian actors in Italian, so I guess in the US they'll have subtitles. It does largely recount the story, although it departs from it in some ways that I find difficult to take, but he does become a priest in the end, and in part tries to convert his family and other Jews. But anybody interested, I'd suggest rather than see the film, but read the book.
So unfortunately, we're out of time, although I know there are many more hands. We do have some refreshments outside for anybody who'd like to stick around. Professor Kertzer has generously agreed to stick around for a few minutes as well, if anybody would like to say hello or thank him for this wonderful presentation. So our thanks to both of our participants, and have a wonderful night, everyone.